Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne, thanks so much for making time for us, sir.
It's a real pleasure to be with you.
So let's start first with the headline number, the deficit. The deficit for last year did come in about $11.5 billion lower than had been projected in last year's budget. But many of the economists that we've spoken to pointed to two reasons for that improvement: higher than expected oil revenues and delayed government spending. How do either of those point to stronger fiscal management on your part, and can your government really take credit for either?
Oh, well, listen, I'm going to correct some of that. First of all, if you look, this is not an old story. The conflict in the Middle East, started on 28th of February, and the private sector economists closed their projection on March 11th. So the price of oil is not what you've seen in terms of the impact on these numbers. I think what you're seeing is structural decisions that have made Canada the second fastest growing economy in the G7. And just put that in perspective for the viewers, it's not that Canada's just growing a bit more. We're growing twice as much as Germany, twice as much as Japan, thereabout, 3 times more than Italy. So when you put things in perspective, you say in the fog of uncertainty, to use the word of the International Monetary Fund, Canada has a clear path forward, project of national interest. You see foreign direct investment at record level in this country. And the other thing is that it's also an expense play, in the sense that we've been very fiscally prudent, good fiscal manager, but you have to remember that $60 billion, the comprehensive expenditure review, is at par with what Prime Minister Harper or Prime Minister Chrétien did at the time. This is very significant. You know, Canadians have been tightening their belt for quite some time, and we've been tightening the belt in Ottawa. So yes, you have higher revenues because of growth. You have lower interest charge, debt charge in a way, and at the same time, you have lower expenses. But one thing I want to say to people watching is that of the additional revenue we got, about $7 billion, 2/3 of that went back to people in the form of the housing support that we've given Canadians, and also with respect to the grocery benefit, and obviously what we did in suspension of the fuel tax. So what I want to say is that, yes, there's a higher revenue, but we know that's what's front and center in the mind of Canadians is affordability.
Yeah,
it's the end of the week and the end of the month, and that's why one of the key pillars is housing.
Well, precisely on that. So your government has pointed to measures, but you've already announced those measures. And to be fair, there are several, and you've pointed them out: the suspension of the federal fuel excise tax, the groceries and essentials benefit. But beyond a cut to the base CPP contribution, people might look at this update and not see a whole lot there in terms of new immediate relief for Canadians who are struggling to make ends meet. Are you trying to send a signal that Canadians shouldn't maybe not expect more short-term help for your government when it comes to affordability?
Well, we've always been there. One thing we're not going to wait is just to meet some deadline, you know, like the fiscal update or the budget. When we're there when people need it. And I would say on grocery, people could not wait. When it came to fuel, we had to act. But one thing you did not mention, and it's the only thing that I've seen the opposition applaud, is what we did with respect to the disability tax credit. Making it more easy for hundreds of thousands, perhaps even million Canadians to access the benefit that they are entitled to. We heard from the community. They asked us to expand the practitioner, the professional practitioner who can certify. They also said, you know, if you could add in the list of condition those which have been well established as having an impact on people with disability, and also about the guardians in province. So I would say, if you look at the disability tax credit, I would not undermine that, because actually this is a big thing for a lot of Canadians, and this is brand new. And you talk about, obviously, the Canadian Pension Fund reduction, which is what, if you earn $70,000, it's a $133 reduction at the employee level and the employer. So those are meaningful. But one thing I just want to say, we've always been there for Canadians. We're not going to wait for an update or a budget. If we need to act, we're going to be there. But we have to be fiscally prudent, because the uncertainty we're going through, I mean, people don't need to hear that from me. They watch TV, they understand. There's something called the Uncertainty Index, which is published by the international agency. And I think now you see this is the highest we've seen in generations. So in this fog of uncertainty, I think Canada found its path forward and has been proven to be far more resilient than people expected. Because initially people were saying, are Canadians going to be able to manage everything that's going to go through, because we're intertwined with the U.S. in terms of the economy? And the reality is that Canadian workers and Canadian industry are much more resilient than people expected.
Well, let's talk about that because obviously there is a lot of uncertainty out there right now. As you've alluded to it, Canada's economy is facing some significant risks over the next several years. We're still obviously dealing with the fallout of the Trump tariffs. There's a historic global energy shock, possibly one of the worst on record. What fiscal room does your government still have to respond to those contingencies? Because people see that, yes, there was some, you were able there's some savings that were able to be found. Most of that has already been spent, and they're wondering what contingency fund is there? What fiscal room do you still have to respond to whatever else might be coming down the pipe that we might not anticipate just yet?
Well, that's a very good question. I think you have to look at Canada in the context of our international peer. We have by far the lowest net debt to GDP of any G7 countries. I mean, we're at about 10. If you compare, our next closest partner is Germany, and it's about 5 times more. If you look at the deficit to GDP, we're one of the lowest. I mean, just a bit above Japan, but far better than all the other G7 partners. And you don't need to take it from me, but the International Monetary Fund just said that Canada has the strongest fiscal position of all G7 nations. But you need to make smart investment, housing, infrastructure, productivity, innovation. That's what we did. It's basically a blueprint for growth, and at the same time, tightening our belts. So I would say to people watching at home, it's going to be okay. In this uncertainty, we found our path. Canadians are resourceful people. We have strong fundamentals. We build planes, we build cars, we have natural resources, we have critical minerals, we have the most educated workforce. We're the only G7 country with a free trade with all the other G7 nations. So, we have very strong fundamentals to navigate to this fog of uncertainty. So Canadians should be confident. We're just getting started. Am I saying it's going to be a straight line? No. People understand that, but we have strong fundamentals to go through that.
I just also want to touch on one of the measures that was announced actually yesterday, and that's the creation of this Canada Strong Fund, a so-called sovereign wealth fund, with $25 billion of borrowed money over 3 years to get it started. The details are still scant, and people, I think, were expecting a bit more of an update today, whether it's the government, the governance, the projects that will be funded, the timelines, how people can contribute. Set all that aside, though, isn't it a little tone deaf at the moment to ask Canadians to chip in whatever money they might have lying around at a time when you yourself acknowledge that so many of them are struggling to make ends meet?
Well, I think there's some people who would want to be part of that. I mean, if you have an extra bit of saving as you want, it's to give the opportunity. If you look at the international press, it's staggering. They were saying, I saw some headlines around the world, they say, Canada's creating its own sovereign wealth fund in a very Canadian way because it's about inclusive growth. Most sovereign wealth funds that exist in the world, in Nordic country or in Asia, individuals are not allowed to share in the growth individually. Collectively, obviously, you can because you grow the asset. But we've made a twist to say, well, you know what? If you want, obviously, no one is obliged. But if you so wish, you as an individual investor usually would not have access to this big project to invest. If you have a little bit of money, very difficult to share in these big projects. Now we're saying, you know what? If you want, you can also own a piece of these big nation-building projects that are going to make Canada successful over the long term. So I see that as a net positive. If people want, they have the opportunity, and it's very Canadian to say we're going to create collective wealth, but at the same time, people want may be able to chip a bit of money. And you know what? Time is always a good ally when you do investment. Look at what happened in the Nordic country with their investment funds. People have seen over time, decades, the growth in that. So I think it's just it's another tool in the toolbox. If people want, they'll have a chance to do it. If they don't want, they will benefit collectively from the growth in our nation.
Right. One of the other measures that was contained in today's update is this launch of an effort that you're leading to recruit, hire, and train between 80,000 and 100,000 skilled trades workers. Your own update says Canada needs more than 1 million of those workers over the next decade to deliver on your building agenda. Your party has been in power now for more than 10 years. Is this an admission that your government simply did not do enough sooner to deliver on the building agenda that we know has been on the dock for a while now?
Well, I would say we're building at the speed and scope and scale not seen in generations. So obviously we need more tradespeople, the Red Seal program. This is a step change. This is not just like an incremental program. You have to, go back, I don't even know when in the history of our country, where we have something where we say to young people, we're going to be with you from the beginning to the end. We're talking about 80,000, 100,000, making sure they have income while they train. They have even a bonus of 5,000 at the end. I would say we're going to work with provinces and territories, but we understand that, you know, a lot of young people want to build this country. The dream of Canada is alive and well, and it's great to see that young people will have a chance to build it in their own communities and benefit, because you tie that with the sport investments we're doing, the investment in small craft harbor. These infrastructure investments are going to benefit communities across our nation.
Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne, that's our time. We'll have to leave you there. Thanks again for your time tonight, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Always a pleasure.